US Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, thank you so much for joining us on DW News.
It's my pleasure.
Let's start with the issue around funding for Ukraine. It is a massive issue right now. The President, Joe Biden, has said that it's critically important that the US and EU continue to support financially, but Congress has clearly stopped that funding, and there's a plan to reverse it. Biden says that there is another way. How's that going to work? What is this other way?
Well, you're right. We do have a situation right now where we have what's called a continuing resolution in the United States, and that resolution does not include any increased support for Ukraine. That said, I think President Biden was right with confidence to say that the U.S. will have additional support for Ukraine in the weeks and months ahead. We have to settle this budget issue. It is often contentious. We've been through similar scenarios in the past, but I think the president sent a very clear message to our partners and allies and to the people of Ukraine that the U.S. leadership that we've been able to provide since the war started will continue. And I don't think there's any question about not only U.S. support, but I want to also take a minute and thank Germany for all that it is doing to support not only the people of Ukraine, but the Ukrainian military and all of the countries out there. There are actually over 50 countries that are providing security assistance.
You mentioned US leadership there. What are you hearing from the other NATO allies? Are they preparing to follow you in their funding cuts? What's their reaction been to everything that's going on in Washington?
I think we've had some legitimate questions from our NATO allies to better understand what a continuing resolution is, what the debate actually looks like in Washington. But by good fortune, actually, I was on a trip last week with all of the NATO ambassadors. We took them all to Washington, and we visited the House and the Senate. And what came across in those engagements was that, number one, publicly, there's strong bipartisan support for America to continue supporting Ukraine in this moment. Americans fundamentally understand what's at stake. And number two, the majority of members of Congress want the United States to continue supporting Ukraine. So that was an important message for our allies to hear on that trip. And I think that's what I'm trying to get across here in the NATO alliance, to reassure our friends that this will eventually get sorted out and that the United States fully expects to continue playing the leadership role that it has. And we expect and anticipate our allies across the NATO alliance to keep providing the important assistance that they've been donating as well.
So moving on to the Sweden issue, Turkey and Hungary still haven't ratified Sweden's entry into the NATO military alliance. President Erdogan of Turkey says that the approval is tied to US promises. Can you tell us what those promises look like, what your understanding of what he means with those promises is?
Well, on the question of Sweden's ratification, this has been a process that's been fairly straightforward. Last summer, our friends in Ankara raised some concerns as it relates to counterterrorism. And ever since they did that, the three countries of Sweden, Finland, and Turkey met quite regularly to work out those concerns and see what those two countries could do to reassure their friends in Ankara that they were taking those counterterrorism concerns seriously. Finland, as we all know, crossed the finish line and became a member in April of this year. And now the expectation is, now that the parliament is reconvening in Turkey, that we'll see some movement. We've been very clear on our expectations about that. In terms of a U.S. role, there's nothing directly tied to the question of Sweden's accession, but we have done some signaling to the Turks that the U.S. Biden administration supports Turkey's modernization, which includes upgrading their F-16s. But Congress, separate from the Biden administration, has made clear that they would like to see Turkey make a movement and get Sweden's accession done before we get into deeper debates about those F-16s. So Congress has made some attachment here between those two issues, but our job here at NATO is just to encourage our friends in Turkey Turkey to complete the process, especially since Sweden has agreed to everything that was outlined in a trilateral memoranda last year. So we feel Sweden is ready for membership. They'll make a major contribution to alliance security, and we hope that our friends in Ankara move out soon on accession, as well as our friends in Budapest.
So you've expressed support for the F-16s, and maybe he's seeing that as a promise?
Well, I think, frankly, there's been a lot of exchanges over the last year. I mean, a number of exchanges between President Biden and President Erdogan. They've talked about this particular question. I think President Erdogan fully understands that he has President Biden's support for the modernization of their Air Force. But again, there is a separate piece to this that rests over in a different branch of government.
Now, moving on, media reports are saying that Moscow might be preparing to test a nuclear-powered missile. Does that track with what your intelligence is saying? And can you tell us a little bit about what the US might do if Russia starts testing nuclear-powered missiles?
Well, I don't have any information on that particular breaking news, and I hate to get into any hypotheticals. What I will say is there have been instances for over the last 19, 20 months or so where we have heard some sort of threat coming from Russia. In many cases, they've talked about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. That's been something that they have threatened. I will say we take their rhetoric seriously, whether it's in regards to the potential use of nuclear weapons or testing some other future capability. But at this point, we don't see any clear indication that they're preparing to use anything in their nuclear arsenal, but we will continue to monitor the situation, and we've messaged them that there would be pretty severe consequences if they were to do so.
Finally, there's been major unrest in Kosovo with Serbian paramilitaries attacking the police. The NATO KFOR mission has been there 20 years to try and keep the peace. Does NATO, do you, as the Americans within NATO, have a plan for if the Serbian military crosses the border into Kosovo? What's your current understanding of what would happen?
Well, you're right. The NATO alliance has a mission in Kosovo called KFOR, and we recently met on the growing instability in this neighborhood as it relates to events that occurred 2 weeks ago where a handful of folks were killed, and also some instability and violence that took place in last May. We just met on Friday about this to talk about what more KFOR should be doing. What we've done for the moment is we've drawn up or called up some of the reserve forces just to plus up the personnel. But we're kind of taking a fresh look. Obviously, we're monitoring events on the ground. We're calling for a de-escalation, but we're ensuring that those KFOR forces have the capabilities they need, the personnel that they need, and that they're at the right level of readiness that they need to be at to prepare for any future contingencies. So it is something that is on the minds of NATO allies, and we will continue to monitor the situation closely.
US Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, thank you for joining us on DW.
Thank you.